You know a man like this. Maybe you are him, the one who watches other people photograph their food, their trips, their faces, and feels nothing. No urge to join, no quiet anxiety about being left out. Just a calm, almost puzzled sense that the whole thing isn't really for him. He might have an account, one photo, maybe two, both from years ago. No captions that reveal anything, no stories, no activity that tells you who he is or what his life actually looks like. And when you search for him online, it feels like looking for someone who decided, at some point, to simply stop leaving a trail. Most people have one of two reactions to a man like this. Either they find it suspicious, what is he hiding? Or they find it strangely magnetic. Almost no one finds it neutral. And that reaction, that instinct to fill in the blank with either suspicion or intrigue, is actually the most interesting place to start. Because what you project onto his silence says as much about social media as it does about him. This video isn't about whether posting is good or bad. It's about what's actually happening inside the psychology of a man who genuinely doesn't feel the pull, what he's opted out of, what that costs him, and what, if anything, it means. Because depending on which type of man he is, the same behavior comes from completely different places. And the difference matters more than most people realize. To understand why this man doesn't post, you first have to understand what posting actually is. Not on the surface, but at the psychological level underneath it. When someone shares a photo, writes a caption, puts up a story, they're not just documenting a moment, they're sending a signal. Psychologists call it impression management. The deeply human need to shape how other people perceive you. Every post is a small, carefully constructed message about who you are, what your life looks like, and how you want to be seen. And in return for that signal, you receive something. Likes, comments, views, a quiet confirmation that you exist, that your life is visible, that other people registered you. Most people do this without thinking about it. It's become as automatic as checking the weather. But here's what makes it worth examining. That exchange has a cost. Every time you post, you're handing a piece of your experience over to an audience. You're converting a moment you lived into content someone else consumes. And for most people, that trade feels completely normal, natural even. For this man, it doesn't. And that's not a small thing. Because the urge to share, to be seen, to have your life acknowledged by others, that's not a shallow impulse. It's deeply human. Which means a man who genuinely doesn't feel it isn't just someone who skipped an app. He's someone whose relationship with validation works differently than most. There are two distinct versions of this man, and they look almost identical from the outside. But psychologically, they're operating from completely opposite places. The first is the man who doesn't post because he doesn't need to. Not in an arrogant way. Not because he thinks he's above it, but because his sense of who he is doesn't depend on being witnessed. He knows what he did last weekend. He doesn't need 47 people to confirm it was worth doing. The experience itself was enough. The memory lives in him, not in a grid. This man tends to have a very stable internal sense of identity. He's not constantly checking how he's perceived because he's not particularly uncertain about who he is. That doesn't mean he's closed off or cold. It means his self-worth isn't running on external feedback. He's found other ways to feel real. Through the quality of his relationships, through work that means something to him, through a private inner life that doesn't require an audience to feel valid. There's something specific you notice about men like this in person. They're unusually present. When they're with you, they're actually with you. Not half present with one eye on their phone, mentally composing a caption. They're in the room. He remembers what you said last time. He asks about it. And that quality, that full attention, is increasingly rare. Most people don't even notice they've lost it. But there's another man who looks exactly like him, and he's operating from a completely different place. He also doesn't post. He also has a near-empty profile. He also gives you the same answer when you ask, "I just don't feel the need." But the psychology underneath is almost the opposite. This man doesn't post because the vulnerability of being seen feels genuinely threatening. Not dramatically, not in a way he'd ever admit, but somewhere underneath the surface, there's a quiet fear running. What if nobody responds? What if the post lands badly? What if people see his life and find it ordinary, or judge it, or simply scroll past without stopping? The potential for that kind of low-level public rejection, even in its mildest digital form, is enough to keep him permanently silent. So he watches. He observes other people's lives from a distance, but he never steps into the frame himself, because stepping into the frame means being evaluated, and his nervous system has decided somewhere along the way that the risk isn't worth it. The uncomfortable thing is that this man often believes his own explanation. He genuinely thinks he just doesn't care about social media. But the reason he doesn't care is because caring would require showing up. And showing up feels dangerous. The avoidance has become so familiar it no longer feels like avoidance. It just feels like preference. So how do you tell the difference? From the outside, you often can't. But from the inside, there's one question that cuts through it. When you imagine posting something, a photo, a thought, a moment from your life, what's the first thing you feel? If the answer is nothing in particular, it just doesn't interest me. That's one thing. If the answer is a low hum of anxiety, a quick mental calculation of how it might land, a quiet relief when you decide not to, that's something else entirely. One is freedom. The other is avoidance wearing the mask of freedom. Most men in the second category have never asked themselves that question directly, because the story they tell, "I'm just private, I don't need that stuff," is a comfortable one. It sounds like strength. And sometimes it is. But sometimes it's self-protection that's been quietly rebranded as principle. There's one more dimension worth understanding: what this choice costs him socially. A man with no social media presence arrives without context. No photos to scan, no posts to analyze, no digital trail that tells you who he is before he opens his mouth. For some people, that's unsettling. For others, it creates a specific kind of pull. The sense that there's something to discover that hasn't already been prepackaged and handed to you. But he gets misread. He comes across as closed off, or mysterious in a way that reads as cold rather than private. Other men assume he's hiding something. Women can't figure out where to place him. And he rarely explains himself, because explaining would require caring about the perception, which is precisely what he's opted out of. He accepts that cost quietly, because the alternative, performing a version of himself for an audience he doesn't trust, feels like a worse trade. Here's the thing about a man who doesn't post. He's not making a statement. He's not trying to be interesting. He's not hiding. He's just decided, consciously or not, that his life doesn't need a witness to be real, that a moment doesn't become more meaningful because someone else saw it, that who he is doesn't require proof. And in a world where most people are quietly performing their existence for an audience that's barely paying attention, that's not nothing. The question was never really why he doesn't post. The question is why that bothers us so much when he doesn't.